Good morning. About time for us to get started this morning. We are we'll be lesson 9 today. That is on page 17. If you'd like a book to work with today, if you don't have one, you can raise your hand. I've got a couple extras. The copier was not cooperating. You're welcome. So page 17, and you can tell on that page we're going to be dealing in Galatians chapter 2. And we'll continue kind of Paul's defense there in Galatians chapter 2. Before we begin this morning, ask Brother Jeff if he would to start us with a word of prayer.
Our God, as we come to you now at this time, we just want to thank you for a beautiful sunny day that you've given us in which we can gather here and to study your word. Not only are we grateful for this day and that occasion, but we also are grateful for the mothers that we have and are thankful that we celebrate them in our lives on this day as well. We ask your blessings to be upon those who are here this morning to study your word. Be with all the teachers here today. Present their material to the class as well for the students here this morning. Help us all, Heavenly Father, to rightly divide the things that are shared with us. These things and study upon them, apply them to our lives, Father, so that we can serve you better.
Amen. Just as we're going to pause this part of the show just for a minute. See if that gets us going. There we go. Sorry about that. So as a reminder, in the book of Galatians, we've talked about this several times, but we are dealing with the kind of the approach that we're taking in this class is we are assuming that Paul is writing this book to. Hey Randy, can you crank those back up, please? I can't see without them. I'm sorry. That Paul is dealing with these churches that some would call the South Galatian churches. And this is not to say that this is the full list of congregations that is receiving this letter. We know that Paul preached in other areas in Galatia that were not strictly these cities. We know he visited these cities. This was his first journey that we can read about in Acts 13 and 14 from Perga, Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe. And we know that later he would come back on his second journey and go back through these same cities. One of the questions that we will deal with, not probably in this class, but in next class, is had this second journey occurred yet when he wrote the book of Galatians? I will tell you the approach that I am taking in the study is that this journey has taken place by the time that he's written the book of Galatians. That is not uniformly or that's not universally believed. Some say that Galatians was written before the first and second, or between the first and second journeys. But the time I'm going to propose would say that we've already been through this second journey. And so Paul has seen these congregations and these brethren at least 3 times. Because you remember on this first journey, we went through the church, we went through the cities kind of from west to east and then backtracked back east to west. And then if it is true that we've been through these cities a third time on the second journey, I say all that to say Paul is very familiar with these brethren. He spent some time with these folks as we have discussed, and we ended here last class on Wednesday, and probably went through this a little too quickly. But this is kind of the timeline that makes the most sense to me. Again, this is just one opinion and not universally accepted, but this is the one that makes the most sense to me. In the end of Galatians chapter 1, Paul recounts some of the things that happened to him in his conversion in a first trip to Jerusalem. And we can line that stuff up pretty well with Acts chapter 9. But when we get to Galatians chapter 2 and verse 1, there's this statement that after 14 years I went up again to Jerusalem. And that's where there is a fair amount of disagreement about which trip to Jerusalem we're talking about. I'm going to take the approach in this class that we're talking about the visit that is recorded in Acts chapter 15. But I'm going to push all of that conversation off until Wednesday, and we're going to look at, on Wednesday, we're going to go back to the book of Acts and look at Acts 15 specifically, at the things that were happening in that context, in that passage in Acts 15, and compare it to what we're going to read today in Galatians chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, and see if we can draw any similarities between those two passages. So for this morning's conversation, I'd like to just kind of push off that where does this fit in the timeline, because that's a whole other conversation, but talk rather about what strictly is revealed in the text of Galatians 2. Because there is this whole conversation I think is interesting about how does it fit and which visit does this tie to. But for today, let's just stay in the text of Galatians 2 without wondering where it fits in Acts. We'll deal with that at another time. But in these first 10 verses, I hope you had a chance to read them and look at some of these questions. In the first 10 verses of Galatians chapter 2, can someone summarize for me the little anecdote or the narrative that Paul tells us in Galatians chapter 2? Could someone give that to me briefly? What does he talk about? Okay. So the context of Galatians chapter 2 is that Judaizing teachers have come in, and where have they come into specifically in this text? Just in these first 10 verses, where are these Judaizing teachers? Where are we geographically in these 10 verses? We're in Jerusalem. Yeah, we're in Jerusalem. So we got Judaizing teachers in Jerusalem. We know from the rest of Galatians that they've infiltrated other areas, but let's just focus on these 10 verses for this morning. We got Judaizing teachers in Jerusalem. So what did Paul do in response to that in these 10 verses? Yes. 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 Yeah, Steve says this, and I completely agree that these 10 verses are a continuation of what we talked about in the end of chapter 1. This is the defense of his apostleship. And so this little anecdote, this story, is intended to further that conversation. We're going to talk about circumcision because it's the context of the meeting, but the whole point of these verses is to say, to continue this thought that we began in chapter 1 and verse 11, this is not man's gospel. It was not delivered to me by man. I didn't learn this from any man. I am not beholden to any man. This is not man's gospel. That's the point of the verses. Yes, Miss Carol?
He's also defending their liberty under
Yes. So this liberty that he talks about in verse 4, that some are trying to bring us into slavery, and he did not submit for a moment in that passage. That's the context for the story in the first 10 verses. And in a lot of ways, it leads into the rest of the book of Galatians, because the context of this story kind of becomes the story of the rest of Galatians, because of the context of this story. But I don't want us to miss the point that the reason that he's talking about this story here in the first part of Galatians chapter 2 is not specifically to talk about circumcision yet. He's bringing up this story to talk about his apostleship and to talk about this point from chapter 1, verse 11. I didn't get this from a person. I'm not beholden to a person. It's not as if I'm a junior apostle to Peter, James, and John. That seems to be again, circumcision is important, but it just sets the framework for the context. And so, why bring it up? Why does Paul tell this little story? Why does this help further his argument? Steve? Yes. 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 So it's very clear, and based on everything Steve said, it's very clear that Paul, and I don't know of anywhere that he goes maybe to more links, maybe 2 Corinthians, where he goes to more links to prove his bona fides, to establish that he is qualified, that he has the authority, and that he is not beneath anyone in his preaching of the gospel, other than Christ, obviously. But it is not as if he is taking his orders from anyone else or took orders from anyone else. He goes to great lengths to establish that. Again, think about chapter 1. I didn't receive it from anyone. When I was initially taught it, it was by revelation. And now in chapter 2, the key point in chapter 2 that we're going to talk about and leading up behind that. Roger. Mm. Yes. Yes. Roger, that's an excellent point, and one I hadn't thought about. Would these folks have known Barnabas? Very well, right? Very well. That Barnabas was with Paul on those first two visits, right? The first trip through, and then the return visit. These churches would have known Barnabas very well, and so as Roger notes, Paul puts him forth here as a witness to the things that happened in chapter 2. Yes. Yeah. Well, we'll get to those guys. I mean, to Steve's point, there had to be. You can understand the human tendency to do this. There had to be this sense that the genuine article came out of Jerusalem. There had to be that sense. That's where all this started. That's where the apostles lived. That's where Jesus died. That's where the seat of Judaism, that's where the temple was. That there had to be this sense that the real stuff came out of Jerusalem. And getting over that sense was a really, really difficult, decades-long process especially for Jewish Christians to get over. And the book of Galatians is part of that process.
That same point, it didn't come from, he didn't assume that because he was sent to the Gentiles that the Jewish law was just out, and it didn't come from, so it didn't come from his assumption, or, even those guys, but the Spirit revealed to him to go up there and make sure that when he was preaching to the Gentiles, in verse 2, that he wasn't running and had not run in vain, and so he's kind of pointing out, like, these guys who actually, the originals actually saw Jesus, they're my witnesses, but, the Spirit's my witness. He sent me up there with the gospel that I preach to the Gentiles to present that to them and make sure that I wasn't preaching in vain.
So Tara notes what is said in verse 2, and let's talk about that just a moment. That the reason that he went to Jerusalem was in verse 2, to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. That's the English Standard Version. Your version may read it. It's slightly different. What do you think it means that Paul wanted to make sure that he had not run in vain? Because I think that understanding what that means unlocks a little bit about what this passage is about. What would it have meant if Paul had decided, no, if Paul had been running in vain, what would that have meant? Or what would he have seen that would have caused him to believe that? Okay? So Carol says he went to establish that the apostles had the same gospel he had. Okay, Ron?
Well, no doubt knew that the apostles in Jerusalem were taught by Jesus himself.
Yes.
And if he'd been out here teaching something with Revelation, contrary to what they were teaching, then he might have been wasting his time.
So Ron notes that, again, this comparison, I received this by revelation, you guys received this by revelation. We need to make sure we're on the same page here. Agree with all of that. What's the right way to lead into this question? If there were Judaizing teachers in Jerusalem who were going to go into Galatia and teach something different, what was that going to do to Paul's effectiveness in his work? If the Judaizing teaching was correct, then the liberty in Christ was in vain. I agree with that point. What do we think? What was Paul's, again, how much time and effort and blood? He was stoned here, remember? How much time and effort and blood was spent on these Gentile churches if the apostles in Jerusalem were going to condone Judaizing teachers going to Galatia? What was that going to do to Paul's effectiveness? It was going to undermine his effectiveness completely. It was going to completely undermine what he had worked to do. And so I don't think we should read this verse as saying, I wanted to make sure that I had the same gospel they had. I understand that's part of it. But it's not as much, I want to make sure what I had was correct. I don't think Paul had any concerns that what he had was correct. I think that it was, I wanted to make sure that everything that I had worked for, they weren't going to destroy. And as we read why the book of Galatians was written, what ended up happening? The things that he had worked hard for, Judaizing teachers had gone up and attempted to destroy. The very thing that Paul was worried about, in my judgment, in Galatians 2 and verse 2, had kind of happened. That's the reason that the book was written. Now, not that the apostles condoned that. That's not what I'm saying. But clearly, Judaizing teachers had come to Galatia, and clearly they had led some people astray, and it had made Paul's work more difficult, to the point where later on, in some of the later books, the churches of Galatia aren't even mentioned. There is some possibility these churches apostatized completely. We don't know that, but it is interesting that you get to 2 Corinthians, and Paul talks about where he's going to make collections for the churches, and Galatia is not referenced. The thing that Paul was worried about may have, this was what he was concerned about. I've done all this work, and now these Judaizing teachers are going to go undermine it. Roger, do you have a comment? Yes.
What Paul was doing, not just his revelation, he's delivering the decrees that were set forth by the apostles in the council.
Yes.
He went through Galatians. He says, when you departed from the gospel, this was the decision of the apostles. I was there at that meeting. You got their testimony. I'm delivering to you what the apostles decided.
Yes.
So the council in Jerusalem, I think we have evidence it has taken place. This is part of what Paul did on his missionary trip. He's delivering these decrees, so these Judaizing teachers have to deal with that now.
It's very clear that in the end of Acts 15, the beginning of Acts 16, the discussions that happened in Acts 15, whatever you want to call that meeting, the Jerusalem conference or whatever you want to call that meeting, those decisions Paul was taking to Galatia. No question. That is absolutely, that's firmly established. Yes. No question. That was the whole point of Acts 15. Yes.
They're trying to address that problem.
Here's what I would have us, to that point, Roger, here's what I was having us thinking about. When Paul left from Jerusalem after Acts 15, he has, we're going to talk in detail about Acts 15 next class, but essentially this conference in Acts 15 holds exactly what Paul talks about here in Acts chapter 2, that we're not going to hold the Jewish customs on these Gentile believers. And he takes that message to Galatia in Acts chapter 16. Is he telling them anything different than what they've already heard? There's nothing in that message that is going to be novel to them. How do we know? Acts chapter 2, verse 6. I think this is such a critical verse to understanding what Paul is trying to say here in these first 10 verses. And from those who seem to be influential. Who would that be? The apostles, no question. To those who seem to be influential. Remember, he's talking about a meeting that he had with, and he mentions names, Peter, James, John, verse 9. Those who seem to be influential. Why would these seem to be influential? Because they were. These were apostles. These people were influential. They held a great deal of weight. They walked with Jesus. They were extremely influential. To those who were influential. Now, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. But to those who seem to be influential, what does he say at the end of verse 6? They added nothing to me. They added nothing to my message. What does that have to do with the whole point of what he's trying to tell the Galatians? This came from Jesus. When I went, yes, I did go to Jerusalem. Yes, I sat before these influential apostles. Yes, we talked about all that. Was that for me somehow to get their stamp of approval? I'm not sure that's how we should understand this. Yes, they gave them the right hand of fellowship. Yes, there was some symbolic importance to that. But this is not the apostles saying, I think this Paul's got it. Paul says they didn't teach me something better. They didn't show me something that I misunderstood. They didn't reveal something to me to help me better in my teaching. Those who seemed to be influential added nothing to me. Think about what that means to the Galatians. It means this Paul, who came to us, who we believed, who came and taught us, who established these churches, and now we've got people that are coming behind him saying, hey, he's just a Johnny-come-lately apostle. He doesn't understand all of it. He changes his message depending on who's listening. You need to really pay attention to this teaching that's coming out of Jerusalem, because that is where the influential people, that's where the Christianity started. You need to be paying attention to this message coming out of Jerusalem. And Paul would say, there's nothing new in that. They added nothing to my message. I just think that verse is so critical. Yes, sir. Yes. No, Steve, I appreciate that point, and I think that's very relevant to what we're reading here in Galatians. The same tendencies, right? The same tendencies that the Judaizing teachers would have. Again, not comparing the teaching necessarily, but the tendency of, hey, reference this person, or reference this place, or reference this tradition, is very relevant. And those people, places, and traditions may be very, very good. Right? That's not to say they aren't, and that that their study has some value, but to reference them with authority becomes a dangerous thing. Because that's what this person said. That's what they do at this place. That we have this tradition. Those are valuable things to know, but are they authoritative? Is really, really important. And I think that's incredibly applicable. Yes, Ms. Carroll. Yes. There's clearly some things that he says in this book that were not going to please them, right? The charge that he's just going to say whatever makes anybody happy. I think this book would put that to rest. It wasn't going to make them very happy. Okay. So, I hope we've kind of established why these 10 verses fit where they fit in the book. They're very, very important to continuing this argument that, hey, Galatians, what you got from me came directly from the source, came directly from Jesus, and there is not anything that's going to come from Jerusalem that is going to supersede or add to what I have taught you. That was very important to these Christians. There's a verse that comes along later in Galatians, and maybe you've heard this thought that somehow that Jerusalem was the mother church that pushed down decrees from Jerusalem to all the other smaller churches, right? That's a very hierarchical kind of idea, that Jerusalem was the mother church and that all the other churches took their marching orders from Jerusalem. If there was ever that idea, and Paul seemed to know that idea existed in somebody's mind, if you go just very quickly to chapter 4 in verse 26, I almost think Paul addresses that issue head on. As he's talking about this allegory between Hagar and Sarah, he says in verse 26, the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother, talking about the throne of heaven. He said, yeah, we've got a mother authoritative church, and you ain't gonna find it on terra firma here. It's not on earth. That verse, to this whole idea of churches getting marching orders from other churches, that verse should make us think pretty seriously about that whole concept. So I think Paul tackles it head on. Okay, back to the first 10 verses of Galatians chapter 2. The context. So we talked about why this fits in the book where it does. But the specific context of this controversy that he talks about in Galatians 2 has to do with circumcision. We already touched on that. And he brings up specifically an individual that went with him, as Roger said, as a witness, as a Gentile. Who was that? Titus. And Titus is kind of the test case here. He's the test that literally stood in front of these brethren in Jerusalem, and they said, what are you going to do with this guy? How are you going to handle Titus? He was the test. Why was that a test for the brothers in Jerusalem? Why was it a test? Why do we call him a test case? Sorry? He was a Greek. Titus was a Greek. He was a Gentile. So why did that make him what was the test? Why set him in front of the Jerusalem brethren? Whether he needed to be circumcised or not. And what do we know about Titus? He was a Greek. We know that. Probably a younger guy. Yeah, it must have been. Yeah. Was he? Help me. What do we know about Titus? Just kind of a random Greek Paul found, decided to bring him along to Jerusalem. Why Titus? Titus, if you read the places he comes up in the New Testament, and by the way, Luke doesn't mention him in the book of Acts, which is curious, and that's a whole other conversation. But if you read about the number of times that Paul references Titus in his letters, Titus was clearly a very dependable, hardworking, dedicated, God-fearing Christian. And that had to be known. Like Titus was traveling around with Paul and delivering letters and establishing churches and establishing elderships, we learn in Titus chapter 1. Like Titus was incredibly valuable to the work. And Paul set this person in front of the brethren in Jerusalem and says, all right, is he a Christian? And they had to deal with the answer to that question. And if the answer was that he is, then that completely submarined all of this Judaizing teaching. So that's the test. Is Titus a Christian? And that became anyway, I think the context of that is truly, truly important. And their decision about Titus was really important.
I mean, even if Paul's intention was to say I'm not taking any authority from them. If these Judaizing teachers had come into the Galatians might have been considering those in Jerusalem to have some type of authority. And Paul is saying, those guys were saying that this Judaizing teaching is not true. It's false teaching. I think there's a verse in Acts that says, "We're sorry that people went out from us to trouble you with this teaching."
Yes.
And so, even if they did have more authority than me, he's saying they agree with me. So he eliminates all doubt.
If there's any question, Galatians, that what I presented to you was true, let me tell you about this specific instance that happened. If there's doubts that adherence to the old law is necessary, let me tell you about what the church in Jerusalem said about Titus. When I took Titus before them, they said Titus was a Christian. They did not, here's an interesting word, they did not compel him. He was not forced. He was not compelled to be circumcised. They called Titus a Christian. If they're telling you, Galatians, that you are not Christians, that is very inconsistent with what they said about your friend Titus. Titus, for all we know, may have been from Galatia. We don't know where Titus is from. But they said, if they are preaching that to you, that's a very different message than they said to Titus when he was presented as the test case. I think that's very important.
He's presenting conclusions here. In fact, if it is the visit from Acts 15, I mean, there were heated debates.
Yes.
So it wasn't just easy. Yeah, they said he was a Christian,
So Tara notes that this conclusion that Titus was a Christian, if we're talking about Acts 15, and we'll read more about that on Wednesday, but if we're talking about Acts 15, it was not a very simple, well, yeah, of course Titus is a Christian. That's not a big deal. It was a little bit of a contentious conversation about whether Titus was a Christian, if we're talking about Acts 15. And I read something that made me think about that conversation a little differently recently in some commentary. How many Gentile Christians do we imagine were part of the church in Jerusalem? Probably not very many at all. Think about where we are. We're in Jerusalem. It's not particularly comfortable to be a Gentile in Jerusalem, period, right? And so there certainly were non-Jews that lived in Jerusalem, but not a terribly large number. It is conceivable that some of these Christians in Jerusalem had never been confronted with a Gentile Christian. They'd never truly had to look one in the eye and think about it in a very deep way. That maybe they had never, in a very practical, tangible way, had to stand with a Gentile Christian. Like, we all know there's a difference between thinking about things theoretically, intellectually. Maybe they thought about the possibility of a Gentile Christian, but now Titus is standing in front of them. Some of them have heard about Cornelius and they've heard about Antioch, but now they're talking to Titus. Anyway, that put a little different spin on that for me. Yes.
Well, and to add to that, you have to think like their whole generation, they grew up being against
Yes.
they were the enemy.
Yes.
So to speak.
Yes.
And this conversion happens, so not only are they having to learn how to love them and accept them, but now they're supposed to see
Whew, that's a hard one.
had to be very
I think Tara says something so important. Like there's so much in the New Testament about this decades-long process of Jews slowly coming to the comprehension that these folks are our equals in Christ. After generations, centuries of feeling very, very differently. And we can see how it would be natural for a Jew to assume, I can comprehend the idea of a Gentile being one of God's chosen people if they become a Jew first, right? Let's get them into Judaism because that's where the gospel sprang from. That's where Jesus was a Jew. That was the background of all the original apostles. Let's get them into Judaism and then we can baptize them into Christ. As a Jew, I can rationalize that. I can at least fit that within the framework of everything I've ever been taught. If we can get them into Judaism, then we can get them into Christ. But bypassing that completely is saying that these Gentiles can now be an equal to me. That is a really difficult thing to swallow. That's why Acts 15, that's why Titus had to be, like this wasn't just a simple thing for the brethren in Jerusalem to accept. We shouldn't just say that Titus walked in and they said, well, this is simple. It was not simple. There was thousands of years of making that not simple. Peter had difficulty with it. Thank you. We are a week away from talking about an apostle who had difficulty with this very topic. Miss Carol, that's so wise. Yes. So to think that the average practicing Jew was just going to fall in line with this was simple. This was not simple to accept. We've talked a little bit already about question 2. We'll spend just a moment on it. The difference between Titus and Timothy. We already read Timothy was circumcised so he could travel with Paul in his preaching. But here Titus was specifically not. Timothy specifically was. Titus specifically was not. And why is that? Why is there that distinction?
I thought it was because grandmother and mother who had brought him up, knowing.
So I certainly think that some of it, as Carol notes, was that Timothy had Jewish ancestry on his mother's side. And it was going, and what were the implications of that? If Paul took Timothy to an area with Jews and he was uncircumcised, what was that? What were the implications of that? That was going to be that was going to add even another level of complexity, of challenge to say, wait, well, he is a Jew and he was not a practicing, or he was not a Jew that was living correctly under the law even before that was just going to add more difficulty to the conversation. And so to make things easier in his preaching, Timothy was circumcised, but Titus was not. Was that the second bill? Yeah. So on Wednesday, we're going to turn back and look specifically at Acts 15, because I'm of the belief, as of today, that's all I can say, I'm of the belief that Acts 15 is talking about the same conversation. I believe that Titus was part of Acts 15. And so if that's the case, and we go back and read Acts 15 in that context, what does that help us learn about the book of Galatians and about Paul's argument? Thank you for your time and attention this morning, and look forward to our conversation on Wednesday.